It's draft week. Free agency is Sunday. The offseason is as swinging as it gets. And there's rumors flying about the Pacers. What's the latest? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? What will matter in these decisions and these roster building moves? We'll get to the latest on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Tuesday and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today we're diving into the rumor mill, looking at what has been said about the Pacers and what they could be doing this week. The draft starting tomorrow when this comes out, Wednesday night. It's crazy that it snuck up on us so much with the Pacers short off season. Free agency is Sunday, and there's a lot of key dates in between. If you've been listening to the show, you've heard it all summer, right? This week, the contract guarantee date for TJ McConnell on the 28th, Jalen Smith's player option on the 29th. Somewhere in there, a qualifying offer will presumably be submitted. So it'll be topping. The draft itself will happen. This is all in the next 4 days. That's before free agency. So a lot to get to today. Some of it regarding the players I just said, some of it regarding some other guys, a lot of the about some other guys, a lot of it coming from the same reporting, and we'll dive into it all. This week is going to be interesting. So tomorrow we'll preview the draft for the Pacers with Eddie Garrison, looking at some trade stuff, talking more prospects, what'll be interesting about the draft. And then after Wednesday night, we'll see what the Pacers did or did not do. Look at the best available guys ahead of Thursday. And then, of course, after the Pacers do or don't make picks, there'll be a lot more to talk about. Then we'll flow right in from that to the new guys to free agency as it goes. But the 2-night draft is going to make this very arrhythmic to me. We'll see how it all shakes out. Let's dive into some rumors. You've waited long enough. And a lot of this comes from my man, Michael Scotto, who's been on this show before. Finally got to meet him in New York during the postseason, during the Pacers-Knicks series. And his Hoops Hype aggregate mock drafts, they're the best because, one, it puts together a bunch of mock drafts in one place, but he also puts in his own intel into a lot of these. And the very first noteworthy thing here is he's the first person to report on this, at least that I've seen this summer. Scotto says, quote, there's also an early belief that forward Jalen Smith will decline his $5.4 million player option and enter unrestricted free agency this summer. League sources told Hoops Hype no decision has been made formally, but this has been the early indication. So, of course, that could change. And I've talked about why the draft is sort of an interesting inflection point for Smith specifically, right? What does he know about his role entering next season? If Isaiah Jackson's still on the team come Friday, which, I mean, that's what I would figure is the favorite by a mile, but you never know with the draft. If Isaiah Jackson's still on the team come Friday and Smith is going to be potentially the third center entering next season, then his thinking doesn't necessarily have to be about how much he'll make next season. It's about his long-term financial outlook, right? Can he make more maybe by taking a little less next year, but then getting a bigger role so he can get paid more in the future? Or could he even get more over a 3-year deal or a 4-year deal as opposed to 1 year? That's what he has to decide, but it could depend on the Pacers situation. He could extend with the Pacers. He could opt in and extend with the Pacers if he wanted. He could opt out and re-sign with the Pacers. There's a lot of ways this could go, and we can cut through all of them in a second. But the early indication, I do think that makes sense to me. During the season, again, I've always compartmentalized this with Smith when talking about him on this podcast, on the radio, whatever. It's like back in December, January, I remember this very specifically. I was on Query and Company here locally, a midday radio on 107.5 The Fan, and we were talking about Jalen Smith and his future, and if he opted out, where could he go and what could that look like? And we were talking about, like, could he start on the Wizards? This might have been February because they had just traded Gafford. Like, who's their center, right? He could have at the time been the starting center for the Wizards. Now, he's probably not starter level anywhere, but he would still play a lot for a Washington or for, a crummy team in search of front court depth, right? So there's probably a young team where he would get minutes. And so if he's not getting minutes for the Pacers, can he get enough money that he's okay to lose some salary this year in lieu of guaranteed playing time? Because that is what I think Jalen Smith has to consider with his player option. Now, let's be clear. I would never insinuate that any team in the NBA does any tampering or talks to players early. But if Jalen Smith gets an inkling that he knows he has a safe landing spot or offer elsewhere, and has already run through all of these machinations in his head about the money, the playing time, whatever, then he could opt out, right? And I think that right now, if I was advising Jalen Smith without knowing what else is out there, I would probably lean opt out if I'm him. But it's not easy. It's not easy. It's never easy. He'll be unrestricted next year, but if he has a down year, he doesn't play much, then who knows how much he'll get. So he's in a very fascinating spot in terms of what he should or could do. So what should the Pacers want, right? Because I think it's very easy to forget how good he was at his apex this season, because in the playoffs, he was decidedly not that player. He was very much not an additive guy in that setting, and that's fine. He does, not everybody is. He could be if they ran it back and did the playoffs again, but he was not. In this particular year, Isaiah Jackson wasn't stepped up, but the regular season is a thing that matters. And Jalen Smith was, a 10 and 5.5 guy for 61 games this season and made 42% of his threes and improved as a defender and is actually a good rebounder on a team bereft of good rebounding, right? Like, that's a valuable player. And from the start of the season until Christmas, I'll just make up Christmas for now. Maybe I'll do a better cutoff if I don't like the number. But from the start of the season until Christmas, scorching hot from deep, hit that 70% of his threes till Christmas. That's not a mistake. I just said out loud. 70% of his threes dropped until Christmas. Through January 15th, so right around the Siakam trade, he was still at almost 50% from deep, but he cooled off decidedly by the end of the year, and he finished still at 42.4%. But from Christmas to the end of the regular season, he only shot, air quotes, 35.9% from deep. That's still good. 36% from three is good. Playing like Myles Turner has value. Like, the Pacers clearly liked him. He was the backup center all season, but he got hurt a lot, and then Isaiah Jackson played better than him in the postseason. And I'll just put the nugget in your head that in the preseason game, this is a preseason game, not a regular season game, in the very first preseason game, so the day the only game the whole season, the Pacers had to come in with no game data to say, here's what we think the rotation should be. Isaiah Jackson was the backup 5. And Jalen Smith outplayed him by a mile. And then Jalen Smith outplayed him for a month. And then Jalen Smith kept outplaying him and earned the backup center spot. But like, going into last season, I would argue, and I think that the action spoke for this, that they had Isaiah Jackson ahead of Sticks in the pecking order. And then by the end of the season, Isaiah Jackson was playing in the playoffs and Jalen Smith was not. So if they enter next season with Jalen Smith third in the pecking order, and they now know, the Pacers, that they have small ball options with Siakam at the 5 or Toppin at the 5, maybe they want to try Jarace Walker at the 5. Do they want to play a third center that much? Who knows? And so Smith has to decide with that information what he wants to do. And if he does opt out, the Pacers have early bird rights. They could still offer him what it would take to keep him if they wanted him around. But I would not expect that. I'll get to that in a second. They could extend his contract if he opted in. I would also not expect that. He could get up to the Nembhard extension. The reason I would not expect that is because of the tax. We talked about that already. If he opts out, they'd have 19-ish million, almost 20 away from the tax, and they could keep Obi Toppin and have wiggle room to like get a better vet. And that, I think, would be a good offseason for the Pacers. And then Obi Toppin's your third big nominally, and you sign a veteran center, and boom, you're happy with that. Because they can't give him a raise and keep Obi, or they can't give him a raise and use their non-tax pyramid level exception. So if he opts out, I would imagine his time with the Pacers is over, unless he's opting out to take like a 3-year, $10 million deal with the Pacers, which why would he do that? So in my head, if I'm Jalen Smith and I opt out, I know it's because I've got an offer somewhere else that's not Indiana. That makes sense for me. And I don't know if the Pacers would be, financially, he's a good player. Like, he played well last year. I think they'd be upset to lose a good player, but financially, I think they'd shrug and go, okay, we have to deal with this. So we'll see on that decision. I truly don't know. I think Scotto's reporting is fascinating. That's the only indication. And I do think there's a way that a team that is young or is developing could look at this guy and go, this is a former top 10 pick who's 24 and does not turn 25 until next March. Like, he is still a young player. I think he's still younger than Chris Duarte was when they picked him. And that's kind of a knock on Duarte's age at the time of that pick, but also to just tell you how young Jalen Smith is. And this guy just averaged 10 and 6 and shot well from deep. Like, there's a chance that that's a $25 million player over 3 years. I don't know what he can get on the market. Centers tend to not make as much as people think, but I'll be fascinated to see where this could go. Can he get like a Jock Landale contract somewhere? I don't know, but I'd imagine that if he's thinking about his long-term earnings or long-term chance to maximize his long-term earnings, opting out is maybe the best option. But if there's nothing available to him, opt in, see if you can weasel back into the backup center spot with the Pacers. Good reporting from Scotto, who's going to be the focus of our next segment and partially the third segment too. Before we talk next about TJ McConnell and a contract extension, we have got to talk about FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much I don't want them to stop. I just watched the Stanley Cup final. I never watch hockey. That game was amazing. As the playoffs wind down and all these sports, you get fewer games, and sports aren't sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel lets us keep the sports going whenever we want. All you got to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. WNBA, MLB, whatever you like going on in the summer, you can hook it up on FanDuel. All customers get a boost or a bonus daily on FanDuel all summer long. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon to start making the most of your summer on FanDuel. That's on FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. We are back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. Your second listen, I'll give you two options. One should be Locked On Women's Basketball. So your Talia Goodman and Pat Boylan talk about the Fever. And I was on Locked On Sports yesterday, because I was at Fever Sky talking about that game. Or going out of network, Caitlin Cooper and I did another podcast, this time for her page. I believe that's out today. If it's not, I might have spoiled it. Sorry, Caitlin. But we talked about so much stuff for her monthly mailbag, free agency, draft, a lot of Jarace Walker talk, future of the team stuff, decisions and minutes. We both talked about our own personal lives a little bit too, which was fun and interesting. You get to see me nerd out about my favorite hobby for like 3 seconds. It's a good stuff. Back to the Pacers. So report 2, talked about Jalen Smith. Sometimes that was good 10 minutes. Another one that we've talked about sometimes here on Locked On Pacers that Michael Scotto reported on in his aggregate mock draft. His first one, his second one, I have not finished reading yet. His first one, the first paragraph on the Pacers is, quote, "The prevailing notion around the league is Indiana will look to re-sign forward Pascal Siakam in free agency, check, and extend point guard TJ McConnell." I find that second one to be interesting. Of course, the first one proved to be true. Scotto has been plugged in for forever. If you've been reading him, you know that. But just to put the notion of that. So, what is the deal with McConnell's situation? Fascinating one, once again. Again, if you want to go back in time a year, they did not view him as one of the 10 guys who should play on opening night last season. And by the end of the year, he was the best bench player in the NBA and changed the Pacers season in meaningful ways. He was sensational. 10.2 points, 5.5 assists per game in the regular season, career high in points and assists per possession. And now he's eligible for the same extension as Nembhard and Smith and lots of guys. 4 years, about, I'm now estimating $80 million, give or take, depending on where the estimated average salary comes in. And it can be less than that in years. It could be less than that in dollars. But if it fits within that parameter of the up to 4 years and up to $80 million, it's a legal extension. And so what should the Pacers be thinking about there? Well, if they're already thinking about it, and remember, we heard Chad Buchanan tell us, they really liked TJ in the season he had. And then he was on JMV, the early afternoon, I guess, show on 107.5 The Fan that I mentioned earlier. And he said there that he would like to have TJ as a Pacer for life, right? That's very high praise, and he does. So the thing that TJ McConnell does so well is, yes, he's an amazing backup point guard, maybe the best in the league. He could probably get that Tyus Jones token starting spot on some bad teams, right? He's a good player. The thing that makes him valuable to the Pacers specifically is he can play enough like Tyrese Haliburton to keep playing the same style, right? He can play fast and in the open floor and get to the rim and make a defense rotate and play randomly enough. He can't shoot like Tyrese, not even close, right? He's not as good of a passer as Tyrese Haliburton. No one except for Jokic is, maybe Luka, right? But he can do enough in terms of the speed and tempo element, keep things moving, that the Pacers can continue to run down your throat for 48 minutes, and that matters a great deal for their style and identity, and that is what makes him uniquely valuable to the Pacers, among many things. They've made decisions with him on the roster for the last 6 years now since they signed him. So extending him makes some good sense. He's good. And a longer contract would probably right this second make him more tradable, right? I think that is important to note with extensions. If you sign a guy to an extension and they're immediately less tradable, what was the point of the extension unless the guy's just no doubt going to be on your team the whole time? So McConnell, I think there's good sense in an extension because he's good. And there's now a clear role for him, the way the hierarchy has shaken out for the Pacers, right? Last year at this time, They had all the guards that we've talked about all season with, Haliburton, McConnell, Nembhard, Mathurin, Ben Shepherd. All these guys were already on the team to start last season. But they also had Buddy Hield, and they also had Bruce Brown. So you enter that season as TJ McConnell, and you're like, dang, there's too many guards. There's too many perimeter guys. Now that is less the case. They have the right number currently of perimeter guys. So McConnell can play, and he will have a role on the team next year, especially with how good he was last year. And importantly, for a contract extension discussion and the difference between him and Jalen Smith when talking about long-term money, McConnell was good in the postseason, right? So you feel confident about your team's identity on the biggest stage with him out there too as a veteran. That hasn't been the case his whole career, but was the case last year. So the prevailing notion that they would extend him, that makes a lot of sense to me, because if the GM is saying on the record, yeah, we'd like him to be on the team for life, and he was very good for us last year, he's a great culture fit. If watching him play, I can see that he's a wonderful on-court fit, both stylistically and from an effectiveness standpoint. If his contract, there's no hurdles in meeting the agreed price, there's just so many reasons that this makes sense, assuming TJ McConnell would want to stay in Indiana, where, he's been for the last however many years of his life. I believe he has 2 kids, and I believe both of them were born while they lived here. I'm not certain on that. That's just from social media posts. Either way, thinking about what TJ McConnell's life has been, his foundation has been, what his basketball has been, Indiana makes a lot of sense for him as a fit, and the Pacers should want him given what he just was. The question would be, if you're the Pacers, if it turns 35 or whatever, pick your age where you feel like he won't be as effective. Is this like, we got to be careful about the back end of this next deal. He's getting on the other side. He'll turn 33 during next season in March, and that's not a death sentence. Like, Kyle Lowry's been amazing through much older ages. McConnell relies on some speed, but he's mostly just very tricky and agile. So I think he'll age fine. His IQ is very high, but at his height, you got to worry about that stuff. So what is the right contract to extend TJ McConnell? Because for McConnell, it has to be a good enough extension offer that he doesn't want to get into free agency instead. Because he could just play this year out and enter free agency next year with full bird rights from the Pacers and say, no, I'd rather just figure it out then. I could get the full mid-level from someone. So if he can get the full mid-level from someone, then anything short of like $13 million as the starting salary of an extension probably wouldn't do it. But how much more than that, right? He's about to make 9.3 next year. Could they do like 3 years, $40 million? Is that too much for TJ McConnell right now on a contract extension? I don't know. 3 years, $45 million, I believe. Yeah, I think that's fits in the parameters of the early or the vet extension rules. Something like that. Could they get TJ McConnell on that kind of deal? That would make sense to me. Good backups are worth mid-teens now in salary, and he's a very good backup. So that would make sense. But what does he think, right? Can he make more than that in the open market or whatever the offer is? Or is this where he wants to be so much that if he can get the most money they're willing to offer, he'd be happy? I don't know. But I do think there's good sense in this, mostly because of the stylistic fit. You can't be certain that a different third point guard would fit in this way. That said, the factor that makes any extension with a guard interesting is they have a lot of ball handlers. There's been reporting on them potentially extending Andrew Nembhard. There's been reporting on them potentially extending TJ McConnell. Tyrese Haliburton obviously has a 5-year contract. They already have that is a lot of touches to go around. And we talked about the usage rates with those 3 guards. Caitlin and I did on the point guard season review episodes, and I was befuddled. I had to do a lot of editing because I was spending a lot of time pausing, saying nothing during that conversation. Now Mathurin's in the mix too, and he also requires touches and should get some of them from other guards. So how does that pendulum swing? And if it does swing, does it hurt TJ McConnell's touches? Does it hurt his value to the Pacers specifically? That's where this gets interesting in an extension talk. What are you signaling about your team and your backcourt by doing any contract extension? Because if they extend both McConnell and Nembhard, what happens if Nembhard takes off? Maybe you just trade the guy later, which is why I mentioned the tradable contract part of an extension, but you don't want to extend a guy just to think about trading him later. So I do think an extension makes more sense than it doesn't for McConnell, certainly. And I think if they can agree on a price, they should do it as the Pacers, but they just have a lot of backcourt questions to answer. And I think that those questions would become a little louder if they gave McConnell a contract extension, and even louder or more if they did that and then also gave Andrew Nembhard an extension, which we talked about on the last Rumors podcast. So that's a good nugget from Scotto, very interesting. I don't know. I don't really know what's going to happen here, but I would be trying to do this as the Pacers, knowing that it might force me to make a different decision in some point in the future, whether it becomes a painful trade or something like that. Couple more things to get through here. The draft, Jarace Walker coming up in the rumor parts here on Locked On Pacers. Back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, Locked On Cavs coaching carousel spinning. Kenny Atkinson to Cleveland. Locked On Bulls for the Giddy Caruso trade, or Locked On Thunder. JJ Redick's officially the coach of the Lakers. He had some stuff to say about Rick Carlisle at his press conference and dropped some F-bombs. Locked On Lakers for more on that. I mean, every team's going to give you something. Draft week, coaches, transactions are happening. They're all great, but for the most recent news around the league, those are the places to go. More with Scotto here. Thank you, Michael Scotto, for giving me almost a full podcast worth of information. This one I'm not going to spend as much time on because the phrasing kind of dictates so. Firstly, he said Indiana, the Pacers, is looking to replace Pat Knight, who was a scout for the team and recently named head coach of Marion University. That is Bob Knight's son, Pat Knight. Congratulations to him. Pacers need a new scout. I have no idea who in the scouting world makes sense for them to hire. I don't know enough scouts to say that, but either way, the Pacers are looking to hire a scout now. Pat Knight is now the coach at Marion. The other actual roster thing in the paragraph right before that was, this is from Mike Scotto and Hoops Hype. In other Pacers news, rival executives are monitoring whether the Pacers will keep forward Obi Toppin in restricted free agency. If the Pacers re-sign Toppin, several rival executives believe Jarace Walker could become a trade candidate and are monitoring the former number 8 overall picks availability. That is a lot of rival executive monitoring speculation-y stuff. And I totally get where they're coming from. If you're another team and you go and you look at the Pacers, you go, whoa, they're going to go to year 2 of Jarace Walker and still not have a role for him? Are they going to trade him? Are you going to think like that? And maybe they think back to what Goga's career looked like. But if you're the Pacers, you'd say, no, we have a plan for him. We'll see where this goes. We want to bring him along at our speed, but we're in a winning mode now. So that had enough, that had enough from other teams and monitoring. Okay, like the Pacers are monitoring stuff too. Level of stuff that I'm not going to dive into this too much. What I will say is, under the premise that this was reality, right? Let's just say that the Pacers re-sign Obi Toppin, like, well, let's trade Jarace, right? The problem is trading Jarace just as Jarace Walker would be very hard, because could you actually get something that solves your problem? Because now if you trade Jarace for a good player, now someone else isn't playing who's either good or young on your team, right? If you trade Jarace for a vet now who's older, who's now out of your rotation that is good or young, you come back to the same problem, maybe on a lesser scale, but you still have the same problem. And if you trade Jarace for picks, what does that do for you as the Pacers, right? What do picks do for the Pacers right now? And obviously picks can be traded again in the future, but so could Jarace, right? So I don't get why the Pacers would want picks. They're trying to win right now. So the tricky part of that situation is there is a potential reason to trade Jarace Walker at some point. It's not right now, and it's not just trade Jarace because he wouldn't have minutes. It would be trade Jarace and this salary and this other young thing and maybe a pick to get OMG awesome player. So I get why rival executives would be monitoring the Pacers and their much depth. And I'm not saying this to cover this up or say like this isn't a big deal. Maybe it is. But what I am saying is the phrasing, one, makes me think that it's just other teams speculating. And two, Scotto's my guy. Two, what I don't get the good of just like a Jarace Walker trade, period, for the Pacers unless they get some value that would be unforeseeable to me at this point. So that one, less so than the first two passes the smell test. But I get why rival executives would think that. In fact, if I worked for another team that wasn't the Pacers, I don't work for the Pacers, to be clear. But if I worked for any team and I was, looking at the Pacers, I would be wondering what they're thinking and how they're going to sort all this out with their combination of veterans and young talent. A very interesting spot. Okay, let's talk about the draft for a second. Not a lot of hubbub about the Pacers draft, ironically, to this point. And I think that that's because of just where they pick in this draft. 36 is their first pick, and it's not a good draft. So there's not going to be a ton of buzz about the Pacers. The other problem is they don't have a lot of roster spots or obvious needs. So it's not like it's easy for an agent to leak out that the Pacers really want their guy, or some other team to say, oh, the Pacers have been trying to trade up with that. Like, they don't have a clear positional need. They don't have a need to add more depth for a young guy who also wouldn't be playing, right? It's just hard to really cut through and figure out what they'd be doing. I think they are prime time, pick the best player available team, right? Whatever the position may be. Maybe you just take the best wing available and you're happy with it if you're the Pacers or whatever, but not a lot out there. I would remind people of last year for a second. Bobby Klintman played for Wake Forest and now played in Australia. I hope I'm not saying his name wrong. To be clear, I've actually never watched him play. He was rumored to be a guy the Pacers had interest in. I can't remember who reported it, but there was a report last year that said from the draft combine, the Pacers were high on him from a reputable source, so much so that I talked about it on this podcast. And then a non-reputable source that I won't say who it is said that he had a draft promise, but did not say it was from the Pacers. And then after that report came out about the draft promise, he dropped out of the draft. So clearly he didn't have a draft promise, which made me feel better about the non-reputable source part. But it is worth noting that when two people report that there's some chatter about a back channel team potentially having interest in a guy, that's something. And Klintman went to Wake Forest 2 years ago. He went to over to Australia to play last year. And I bring him up because I was reminded of his name today, reading through Kristen Peak's mock draft in Yahoo Sports, where he was mocked to the Pacers at pick 36. So that is, I guess, draft buzz about the Pacers. A reputable source last year was talking about them being potentially interested in him. But that was a year ago, right? Their dynamics have completely changed. He's younger. They might be looking for more experience, or he can't fit into their style as much as they would have known because of now how fast they play. I don't know what this even looks like as dynamics change, but that is something to note. Mock drafts kind of scattered all over the place. Keishad Johnson's in a lot of them for the Pacers at this point. Nikola Duricic has been in multiple for the Pacers. I went through like the 5 or 6 biggest ones. Cam Christie's in a couple, the shooter from Minnesota. But I think the fact that it's kind of spread out says a lot about, one, how late they're picking, two, the fact that they have no obvious positional, like, oh, that should be the thing they want. And I think that, you're going to see a lot of guesswork, for lack of a better term, with the Pacers. What they'll specifically do is hard to say. Jonathan Givony mentioned them on a recent ESPN podcast with Zach Lowe, talking about, teams that are late in the first round, potentially thinking about getting extra seconds because of their salary situation to make future trades. They do have 3 seconds this year. I've said that there's good sense in picking at 36 to get a young guy in the pipeline, because there's probably going to have to be a young guy trade at some point in the next 2.5 years. Well, if you can get into the late first round, maybe that makes that a little easier. How high they could get, 26 if they traded all their picks, something like that, 27. I don't know. That is something to monitor. I need to re-listen to that quote. I just heard it like 30 minutes before I started recording myself. Everything Givony's on is worth diving into. He's got a lot of good intel from around the league. The draft starts tomorrow. Eddie Garrison's going to join us on this show to talk about it. Tomorrow we'll get into thinking about draft trades for the Pacers. Up, out, back, whatever direction you want to use. You talk about parallels, something, I don't know. Any direction they could move, we'll talk about it. We'll talk about players to like, strategy to consider. Are they just picking two-way guys this year? Who knows? Who knows with their roster crunch, what they could be thinking. And Eddie and I will try to figure it out. Wednesday is the first day of the draft. If the Pacers don't trade into the first round, they'll be done. That'll be it. It'll just be no picks for them. And then they pick the Thursday afternoon. And so breaking down who did get picked, who's the best left, could the Pacers have done anything? That'll be Wednesday. And then Thursday onward is breaking down what the Pacers have done, their new look team, what it all means for their path forward. So lots of good stuff coming, and a lot of chatter about a lot of stuff we talked about today, because McConnell's deadline is one day after the draft. Jalen Smith deadline is Saturday for his player option. Stuff is coming, and stuff is coming fast. You'll get it all here on the Locked On Pacers podcast. We'll go 7 days a week until probably summer league starts now, because free agency's heating up and the draft is here. Hope you guys enjoyed today's show and learned something. If I said something stupid or something that you disagree with, let me know on Twitter at Tony R. East, or if you're watching on YouTube, by commenting down below. Can't wait to see what everybody thinks about these prospects, because I have not had a ton of time to dive into anybody. I have draft takes all on earth with Eddie tomorrow, I suppose, but they're mostly about the top guys. Thank you all for listening today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll see you very soon.